Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. My name is Lizzie Meister, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here. And I'm thrilled to get to welcome you to the first Synagogues of the South with Dr. Sam Gruber. This is a really wonderful opportunity to hear about this story of Southern Synagogue architecture from an expert. And before we get started with the lecture, we have folks on Zoom and folks here in person, so I just want to set everybody up for success. Folks on Zoom, there will be a question and answer period at the end. I invite you to write your questions in the chat and I will ask them here. And folks in person, hands up, and I will run around with a little microphone so that the folks online can hear us. And a recording of this presentation will be available in 5 days. So we'll get to review it. There will not be a test, but you can review. So with that, I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Sam Gruber. Samuel D. Gruber has been a leader in the documentation, protection, and preservation of historic Jewish sites worldwide for 35 years. He was a founding director of the Jewish Heritage Program of World Monuments Fund and research director of the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of American Heritage Abroad. He presently directs Gruber Heritage Global, a cultural resource and consulting firm, and is president of the not-for-profit International Survey of Jewish Monuments. Since 1994, he has taught as part-time faculty in art history and Jewish studies at Syracuse University. He has also taught courses at Binghamton, Colgate, Cornell, Temple University, and Le Moyne College. Dr. Sam Gruber. And remind you to put that mic on.
Start my timer, because anyone who knows me well knows that sometimes when I start talking, I don't often stop. Okay, good. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first visit to the new incarnation of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. I was at the old one, the very old one in Utica, Mississippi, many years ago as the guest of Macy Hart, one of the founders of this institution. And I was brought down in 1991, that's before a lot of you were born, to lecture for the centennial of a little synagogue in Mississippi in Port Gibson. And unbeknownst to me, some of the material I used, I stole actually to give that lecture, was taken from a master's thesis that was written by a young man named Kenneth Hoffman. And Ken Hoffman is now, of course, the director of this museum. So our paths are mingled. Anyways, it's a pleasure. As Lizzie's introduction suggested, a lot of my work over the last 35 years has actually not been in the United States, but in Europe. And if you Google me, which I'm not saying you have to Google me, but you'll find a lot of things connected with synagogues, cemeteries, Holocaust sites in North Africa, but particularly Eastern Europe. But about 20 years ago, I wrote a book called American Synagogues, A Century of Architecture and Jewish History, which put me sort of on the map for studies of synagogue architecture, only because there was no one else doing it. The previous book on the subject had been published 50 years before. We now have a number of publications that have come up in recent years, not in recent years, and there's a younger generation who's working on some of this material, which is very exciting. And the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience has been a center for some of that research, particularly through the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, which it has researched and edited for many years, and that's a terrific online resource. About 10 years ago, it was suggested to me from the College of Charleston, and friends there. They have a great Jewish history
video,
archive, but they're also the home to the William Rosenthal collection of Judaica of imagery that was collected by the former rabbi of KK Beth Elohim in that city. That I might do an exhibition. I had done one for them before, but might do an exhibition, another exhibition. And what would I be interested in doing? And I said, well, how about we look at some of the postcards of Synagogues of the South? Because there's a lot of buildings there that never been published, never been mentioned, are no longer remembered. They've been torn down. They weren't much photographed, and often we only know them from a single postcard image. And out of those discussions came an exhibition that kind of premiered in the first years of the pandemic called Synagogues of the South, Architecture and Jewish Identity. It's not a comprehensive history of the synagogues of the South. That's almost impossible. There's so many, such diversity. But it's taking these postcards and looking at them and trying to describe the architecture and what it meant at the time and what it means today, but also to write some history of those particular congregations and their buildings. It wasn't representative because only certain types of congregations had the desire or the means to produce postcards, or there were synagogues built in particular places, usually cities, where they contributed to the beauty of the architecture, so that beauty of the urban environment, so that other people, not the congregations, would actually produce synagogue postcards. And that's the case of the one I just showed you from Shreveport, Louisiana. Here, it's on the front of the exhibition. So today I'm going to give you just a okay. So today I'm going to give you a sort of romp through some of those postcards and the synagogues that they represent, and also throw in some other examples to kind of fill things out a bit. But also some of these images are from my own travels, which I've been increasing since this exhibition opened, so that I can see a lot more of the synagogues. Some of them are ones that are represented in the postcards, but also finding new ones. I've also done a lot of work in modern architecture, post-World War II architecture. And there is a fair amount of that, obviously, across the South, and I'll show some examples at the end of the talk, but that's really a second subject. One of the things we're going to do today is into the various styles of synagogue architecture, and you can think of them in a very formal way, and it's not much different than collecting stamps. You know, we have one Moorish, one here, one classical, one here, one modern, but maybe we can dig a little deeper and see what the purpose, what the appeal of these styles was when at the time that they were built. The exhibition presents the South rather broadly. So Missouri, some people would, West Virginia, Texas, are these part of the South? But for the sake of argument, and because all of them have very similar histories, and most of them were looked to Cincinnati and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations for leadership for much of the 19th century and into the 20th century, we include them. And also, they tend to be ignored in other histories. So they're here. If you go to the website with the exhibition, which I'm not going to take you through, you can press on each state. There are other ways to search the many different fields. And this is the one for Louisiana. And while we don't have every synagogue in Louisiana, there are, I think, 7 or 8 that we had postcards of, and therefore we were able to include them in the exhibition. And then online, you could press any of those names or one of the dots, and you would get the image itself, the postcard, and a rather thorough history. In addition, there are 10 essays which are historical in style involved. So let's get into it. I'll just give you how many of you are from Louisiana? How many are tourists? There are a few who are just visiting from other places. Just visiting. Okay, well then this will be an introduction a little bit to what's here in Louisiana. And some of these buildings are still here and some not. I want to show you these because the history here pretty much is repeated in state after state. As you know, Jews settle in America in different waves. We have a Sephardi wave, mostly coming from Amsterdam and England, and sometimes via the Caribbean, starting in the 18th and then into the 19th century. We have a large wave of immigration from Central Europe, from Germany, Bohemia, Alsace, through the 1840s, 50s, 60s. And then we have Eastern European Jews coming in much, much larger numbers towards the end of the 19th century up till 1925 when the borders are closed. And then during this time, there's a movement south and west. So Jews begin to settle through the south. And if you see that, so the exhibitions here, the museum, you know that in almost every town there'd be a small Jewish community, often with eventually with some retail store. My own family has that history in Texas. So it's a generational thing, and it's a story that all immigrants go through. You arrive with nothing, and eventually you put something together, and then you have a little money, you build a store, you build a business. And that's what Jews did. And the same thing with synagogues. You have a little money, you stop meeting in the upstairs of a shop or of a tavern or somebody's house for your services, and you build a purpose-built synagogue. Or if you don't have the money to build a purpose-built synagogue, you buy an existing building. And those buildings that were often purchased were former churches. So just to give you a sense of two of them here in Louisiana, neither of which still survive. Here in New Orleans, the Torah Synagogue, it was not then called the Torah Synagogue, but that's when they merged. Its first building in 1850 was a former Episcopal church. And you can see it's in a classical style. And then in Baton Rouge, the first big building of B'nai Israel, which was an older building. The date isn't quite certain, but it's probably from the 1880s. And it was purchased from the Christian Brothers, Catholic Brothers, where it was used as a school, and then it was converted into a synagogue in 1877. So the reuse of buildings is very common. Many Americans think of synagogues being turned into churches because so many urban synagogues have been left behind as Jews moved to the suburbs in the post-war period. But it was it's on both sides. Jews have used former churches, and Christians have used, and now Muslims have used former synagogues. Recently, I lectured out in Irvine, California, in a building that had been originally an ice rink, but a new congregation was formed. They bought the ice rink, and over 20 years, they converted it into a synagogue. So in New Orleans, there were a number of buildings, number of congregations, and from the Sephardi congregation, which was the very first, you had a break off from an Ashkenazi one because they didn't all get along. This was very typical in Jewish history. And then the Orthodox and the Reform would split because they couldn't agree about an organ, and they couldn't agree whether to have 1 or 2 days for Rosh Hashanah, or they couldn't agree on where women should sit. Many different disagreements. Out of all, eventually coalesced the Reform movement in America, but originally it was an ad hoc type of internal divisiveness in each congregation. What it led to was many, many more buildings. And these are two in New Orleans, Beth Israel, former Beth Israel, and the Menorah Institute, which are no longer in use. But there are many, many, many others. And they represent different styles. Some use classicism, some use the Romanesque, some use Gothic, and they're typical of the period. So these are all Louisiana synagogues from the mid and late 19th century, and it's what I call the tower style. And this derives from trends in Europe. And there are plenty of Christian churches which have 2 towers, but it does differentiate synagogues somewhat from the more typical American single steeple church, which would have dotted urban landscapes at the time. Symbolically, the 2 towers were interpreted as representing the columns on the Temple of Solomon, Joachim and Boaz, but that might be a post facto explanation, because functionally what they did, particularly in Orthodox synagogues where women and men were separated, these are box-like buildings, so the women are upstairs in a gallery and the men are downstairs. The towers were the stair towers to get those women upstairs without having them enter the main sanctuary, to keep that separation intact. As many of these Orthodox congregations eventually evolved into something more liberal, either what we call conservative today or reform, that separation ended, and that's one reason stair towers disappear, that these towers disappear, but there are other ones as well. This is a synagogue here in New Orleans, which it's I think it's the oldest standing synagogue building. It's not the first synagogue in the city, but it's Gates of Prayer, and it's from the 1860s, and it was derelict and abandoned for a long time. This photo a few years ago was during the process when it was being turned into condominium apartments. So the outside is still there, but not the inside. It's a brick structure, very typical of the post-Civil War era, but it has classical features. They're hard to see in this image, but they would have been plastered, so they would have stood out like a temple front. What many people are familiar with across the South are classical style synagogues. The earliest ones, which we'll see in just a minute, are from Charleston, Baltimore, and a few other East Coast cities. But New Orleans follows suit very quickly. But at the turn of the 20th century, there's a revival of classicism for reasons I'll get into later. But these spread like wildfire across the South, and Louisiana has many examples. And many of these survived until recently, until the move of their congregations out to modern synagogues in the suburbs. And some of them still survive today, but are repurposed as theaters or cultural centers, or sometimes as churches. This one was in Alexandria. It's a particularly beautiful one. Looks a little bit like a Palladian, like the Villa Rotondo in Vicenza, or the Pan in Rome. The architects are all looking at classical sources. Just a few more from Louisiana, Shreveport, which it's been abandoned for a long time, and their plans afoot. They're trying to raise money to repurpose the building into a civic arts center. And Monroe, Louisiana, and I believe that some of the windows from this building, which was demolished in 1969, are in a reused screen that the museum here owns, but it's not on exhibit. Back I saw it, yeah. But I think that's Monroe. So the most famous synagogue probably in Louisiana today is known as the Touro Synagogue, and this was designed by the Jewish architect Emil Weil, and Weil designed at least 4 synagogues, including this was 1909, including as late as 1928. He worked on Temple Sinai, which is even bigger and up there you can look at later. It's just been done by Cliff on the magnificent stained glass windows from that synagogue, which I'm looking forward to visiting tomorrow. Here you can see a new style that we haven't seen before. It's domed. It's much more horizontal than vertical, more muscular kind of massing, no classical elements. And we'll get to that shortly. And this is what the interior of Touro looks like yesterday when I took this picture. And the dome here. We don't have very many images of the interiors of synagogues before era. Didn't take pictures of the insides. Jews didn't take pictures during on Shabbat or on holidays when most people attended. And most people didn't have cameras. They didn't have portable cameras, and it was a big operation to bring in an official photographer with a tripod. So sometimes when the building first opens, there'll be a picture in the local newspaper. But sometimes buildings have come and gone. They've been totally demolished, and we have virtually no images. That's one reason why the postcard images, which are mostly exteriors, though, are important to us today. One of the projects I'm involved in now is to do intensive photography and documentation, working with congregations to document every synagogue in the South. We recently completed all the synagogues in South Carolina, for instance. Fortunately, that was only about 30, so it was pretty easy to do. But in some states like Florida, there are a lot more, so it'll take much longer. This is another Emil Weil synagogue from the 20s, 1925. This is an Orthodox synagogue, so you can see the interior is quite different from what you saw at Touro. It's still in use. And for those of you, probably most of you know this, most of you are Jewish in the audience, but maybe not everybody. One fundamental difference traditionally in America between Orthodox and Reform is the Orthodox are much more likely, there's separation of men and women, which I've already mentioned, but also Orthodox synagogues have held on longer to the Ashkenazi Eastern European tradition of having a central bima. The bima is the reader's platform in the center of the synagogue, and then the service takes place around that, and then there's a dynamic between the ark, which is at the usually at the east wall of the synagogue, where the Torah scrolls are kept, and the table where it's brought to be read. There's a performative sort of tension in that space. The Orthodox Sephardic synagogues have similar arrangement, but usually the bima and the ark are further apart, often on opposite sides, and so that kind of dynamic between the two places is even stronger. It's sort of like being on a tennis match, and the seats are on the side facing the center, as you can see even in this picture here. So you're not looking straight ahead to the ark, as in so many contemporary synagogues, well, contemporary from the last century, where it's much more of a theater type of arrangement. This is much more in the round, and you're looking at the action in the center. So this is Temple Sinai that I just mentioned, which is also by Emil Weil and other architects. And here you can see it does look so much like the auditorium of a theater, and Weil was famous for his theater designs here as well. One of the important things, and we'll get back to this, but maybe not so much, you'll see generally the space is very open and not heavily ornamented. And so as the 20th century advances, even with classicism, but particularly in the teens, 1920s and beyond, synagogues become much more spare in their decoration, both on the outside and on the inside, until finally, when you get to the modern period, you can drive by a synagogue and you don't know, it could be something, it could be a school, it could be a gymnasium, it could be a big box sometimes. There's a kind of anonymity in some of the architecture. Not always, but sometimes. And then there is this modernism in the post-war period, and I'm just showing one of many examples from Louisiana. This is in Alexandria, and I'm showing this because not too long ago it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It is a spare building, but it's expressive. It has all these elements. The box is mostly broken, and it has great natural light. The architect Max Heim was a Jewish architect, an important modernist, and influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, but also by some contemporary synagogue architects who I might get around to mentioning later, like Percival Goodman and Eric Mendelsohn, who didn't work much in the South, but their works were well known nationally. Okay, so let's look where we're going to go. We're going to leave Louisiana and look around the South. The exhibition, for some reason, had a lot of examples from Texas, so you may see quite a few of those. For some reason, I guess the Jews in Texas like to make postcards of their synagogues. We have very few from, I don't know if we have any from Tennessee, very few from North Carolina. Most of the postcards from South Carolina are all from KK Beth Elohim. So it's not an even distribution, but still, I think we can work out some kind of. So going back to the first synagogues, the earliest synagogues that we have in the continental United States are in Newport, Rhode Island from 1763, so also known as the Toro Synagogue, named after the same man, Judah Toro, who gave money. But then we have the synagogue in Charleston, which now stands and has been in continuous use since 1841. What you're seeing here is the previous synagogue in Charleston. So it's the oldest synagogue that we know of in the South from 1784. And 1791-94. And it was destroyed in the Great Fire of Charleston in 1839. But fortunately, there are some drawings of it. And then after it was destroyed, Solomon Carvajal, the first significant Jewish artist in America and was from Charleston, he did this interior painting from memory. If you look at the synagogue, you might think, well, it looks kind of like a church. It's got a steeple. It's got a bit for light, just as all the Protestant churches of the time had. It emphasizes reading and communal prayer. And on the outside, that's true. It's a little deceptive because this was not a bell tower like the churches had, and there were so many. Charleston was known as the city of churches, the holy city. And a ship coming in from sea would see all these church steeples. Well, a lot of ships, and when their ships came, see maybe this as well, at least from the 1790s on. This was probably more of a light tower, and it let light come into the interior, which you see here. And there's some distortion in this image of the interior, probably the reader's table, which I'm scrolling right here with the cursor. Oh, it's not showing on the cursor. It's right here. Whoops. Let's go back. Here, it was further to the front, and the light, there would have been light coming down from the above as well as from the windows. You can see the balconies up above, very thin columns. They probably were wood. Later, you would see similar columns in synagogues of cast iron, but this is a little early for that. And the vestibule area would have been, sorry, it's not showing up, would have been where the stair tower was. There would be an entrance here, and then a little, it might be an office up there, but a space for the women to go upstairs and then go onto the balcony. So this burned down, and it was replaced by, and this is a little synagogue in Richmond. It doesn't survive anymore, but it's similar in style. And we call this the Georgian style, the round arch style. It just doesn't have the steeple up above. And that's the way things were going. And if the fire had taken place in the 1820s, probably Charleston Synagogue would have been built in the same way, rebuilt in the same way. But the fire took place in 1839, 1838, 1839, I forget. And when it was rebuilt, the congregation adopted the then favorite style of the time, which was Greek revival. And it was favorite because of a number of reasons. There was a kind of political component. Politicians and statesmen and philosophers at the time were likening our democracy, our still a new democracy, to ancient Greece, and trying to find strength from that and inspiration. But also there were recent architectural and archaeological investigations in Greece, which were allowing architects to access for the first time measured drawings, really accurate drawings of some of the great monuments of antiquity, the Parthenon, the Theseum, and others. And not only Jews, but other institutions, churches, different denominations, and also many civic organizations and government agencies all adopted this style. So going up and down King Street in Charleston, you would have seen many, many Greek revival buildings by the end of the 1840s. The style remained popular for quite some time, the Greek revival style. It also was popular in various permutations with the planter class, with the plantation owners in the antebellum South. And that was true in Charleston in South Carolina and also here in Louisiana. So there's also that inclination to associate with the ruling class that Jews have often expressed in architecture where they've been, whether it's medieval Spain, whether it's Renaissance Poland. Their buildings, and sometimes the very architects who build them, are closely associated with the styles of the ruling elites. They may not be as fancy, they may be knockoffs, but whenever Jews could and whenever they could afford it, they would hire the architects favored by the majorities, by the elites, and they would use their styles too. It's only in the late 1700s that we have the first known practicing Jewish architects in Europe, and that's really the early 1800s, and they're very few in number, and it's only in the mid and especially the late 19th century that we begin getting a large number of Jewish architects who are trained in the profession, either as engineers or as architecture, or practicing architects out of these newly formed architecture schools. In America, it's people born in the 1860s who then go to architecture program places like Cornell and MIT, who then begin practicing in the 80s and 90s. That's the first generation of really successful American-born architects. So these are all non-Jews who are being hired by Jewish congregations to build synagogues. So this is KKB today. It's been modified. It was modified several times after a hurricane, after an earthquake in the 19th century, and it moved from being Orthodox to Reform. So the galleries were removed and the space down below widened, and you see their family seating in pews was created. Obviously, the screens for images like this one are a later, very modern addition, and those screens actually pull up. This is when I was there last month giving a lecture for the 275th birthday of the congregation. It's hard to see in this image, but the doors of the ark here are slightly rounded. And I just want you to keep in mind about that distinctive quality, and the four columns, the four Corinthian columns that are in front of the ark, also very distinctive. And these become elements that get imitated in other synagogues later on. You'll also note on the side, there's some stained glass. Originally, synagogues in America did not have stained glass, but by the 1870s, it begins trickling in, influenced by what's happening in churches. And initially, it's patterns. Then we get symbols like you see here, which are just taken from Christian workshops, stained glass workshops, and they're taking these images out of Christian pattern books, and they're using symbols from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, that both Christians and Jews could relate to. You don't get really essentially unique Jewish symbols until after about 1900 in most cases. Okay, so classicism, this Greek revival becomes very popular. We have many instances of it. On the left, Baltimore from 1845. This synagogue still stands. It's part of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And next to it, I show you two images, one I've already shown, of classical buildings from shortly afterward, from about 1850, which were originally churches. And then they were both bought by Jews and turned into synagogues. So the style continues, and we find it on both sides, with Christians and Jews. And Jews have there's some affinity. And I mean, one of the reasons is it is this period of the Greek revival in America, it is unique to churches. So there is something not very church-like about a Greek temple-like synagogue. Most American churches up until this period had looked like English Gothic or French or Italian churches, but civic architecture was classical, and in both cases these fit into this new civic landscape. But by 1857, so just 7 years after the the New Orleans congregation buys, well, it's actually Jacob Toro who buys the synagogue for the congregation, buys the church for the congregation. They're ready to build their own, a purpose-built synagogue, and they choose the same style. So it's this one on the left. We have very few images of it, but it's from 1857, and it looks like a Greek temple. And this continues. This is an example of an Orthodox congregation from the 1870s in Charleston. So it's a style that appealed across the board. but was mostly associated with Sephardi congregations and Orthodoxy until the late 19th century when things change. Another style that was very popular was what's usually called the Romanesque or the round arch style. Sometimes it's called the Rundbogenstil, the round arch style in German. And this is very common in government buildings, in commercial buildings, even in residential buildings in America from the early 1800s through the 1860s, 70s. It's basically simple brick building. Brick was an affordable material for most people with big windows, round arch windows. Windows could be bigger and bigger because window glass was cheaper and cheaper. There's no stained glass in these buildings initially, but that would become more common in the latter half of the 19th century. So these are just two examples, one from Montgomery, Alabama, and another from Cumberland, Maryland. Both of these still stand today. This round arch style takes many forms. This is the Addis Israel Synagogue from Washington, D.C. from 1876. Ulysses S. Grant came and spoke at the dedication. He was trying to make amends with the Jews who he had offended mightily by his Semitic actions and remarks during the Civil War. And this synagogue was abandoned and then it was part of a grocery store for many years. And then in the 1970s, it was physically moved and it became the Jewish Museum for the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington. And then just recently, a few years ago, it's been moved again, and it is now part of the Lillian Albert Small Capitol Jewish Museum, opened new building next door to it just last year. And the interior of the synagogue was sort of recreated. And you can see here, we do have cast iron columns, thin columns holding up the gallery. This was an Orthodox synagogue when it opened, so there was a gallery. It's no longer used today. We find many different manifestations of this round arch style or Romanesque style, and it often has towers, sometimes one, sometimes two. The one on the left is from Dallas, Texas. It no longer stands, and it's in a very rough and rugged Romanesque style, what we sometimes call Richardsonian Romanesque, after the architect H.H. Richardson, who I believe designed the library here, beautiful library, that red sandstone library, just a few blocks away. That's part of the Ogden Museum today. And then we also see the synagogue in Albany, Georgia, which is a brick, but essentially it has the same form. One difference is the Dallas has large steps going up to the first floor, and it was quite common for synagogues to build the sanctuary elevated. That left a deep basement with a high wall off of the ground, which you could have windows, and that's where the schoolrooms would be. That's where students would study Hebrew. Here, of course, there's not much opportunity for a basement, though surprisingly, Touro Synagogue, the existing one, does have a basement, but I don't think you'd want to spend time down there. It's probably other places, the basements were an essential element. And we do have many accounts of synagogues, I don't know of any in the South, but they may exist, where congregations would build the basement area first and start using it while they raise money to build the upper stories. We find that a lot in northern cities in the period of Eastern European migration in the 1890s to the 1920s. But I'm sure it existed here in some places as well. Gothic revival. Everyone says Gothic revival. Why would Jews build Gothic style? It's Christian. It reminds them of, I don't know, the Crusades and persecutions in Europe. Well, you have to remember, most Jews for much of the 19th century came from Central Europe and Germany, and the Gothic was their style too. So you can go to the Altneuschel, which is still in use, from the 13th century in Prague, and it's a Gothic synagogue, and there were many others. But they were using Gothic. They were also using Germans and architects. So the Gothic style was appropriate. This is not an example of that, but there were many, from the 1840s on, many Gothic synagogues across America. Very few of them survive. The reason they don't survive is because those were the first synagogues, usually of German immigrant communities, which then became quite prosperous and wealthy. And then they tore them down, they moved on, and they built bigger synagogues in different styles. Savannah is a little different. The synagogue, I don't know if any of you have been there, it's really quite stunning, was built not so much to meet the needs of a Jewish community, but to meet the civic needs of people in Savannah. Savannah is laid out with square of the city, and each square has a church, and the Jews basically had their church on a square. So it looks similar in form. It even has a cross plan to the other churches. Here's two examples in the upper right, just of the cathedral and of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Not knowing this was a synagogue, you wouldn't know until you go inside. And even when you go inside, it's somewhat baffling. It's very church-like. Here we have some of the earliest stained glass in synagogues in America, which is not surprising because if they were building a synagogue very much like a church, that would be the norm. So we have the first windows in the apse area from the 1870s, and then these are actually memorial windows from the 1890s, but they're intact and quite beautiful. We have little Gothic churches, they call them churches, you see, little Gothic synagogues in towns all across the South and the Midwest. Some survive, some not. Many have been repurposed. This one's from Charlottesville, Virginia from 1884. They had to move it 10 years later, no, 20 years later, because the land where it was taken by eminent domain for a public project, and they moved it brick by brick. 20 years later, they still wanted their same synagogue. They wanted the Gothic synagogue they had built. But it's a very simple building. Here's another one in Goldsboro, North Carolina, another one in Statesville, North Carolina. And then this is from 1903 in Louisville, Kentucky. It was actually the of taking over churches continued as congregations moved, as congregations split off from other ones, and they looked for a building. But in this case, they found a Gothic church, which was perfectly in keeping with some trends at that time. But things were changing, the times were changing, and as we'll see in a minute, there were new tensions in the Jewish world that sort of led to other styles. This is a synagogue that my great-grandfather founded in Branham, Texas, and you can see it looks just like a country church, but it's a simplified version of one of those Gothic synagogues. The windows are not a perfectly oak-jived arch; they're just little triangles. But the intent was to create something along those lines. This synagogue was recently moved. It had not been used for services for many decades. It was physically moved from Branham, Texas, and trucked across 4 counties of central Texas and deposited on the Dell campus in Austin. And there it's once again hosting a daily minyan of Orthodox Jews. So I would have preferred to see it stay in Branham because that's my family history. But my great-grandfather probably would be much happier, is probably, if he were alive, seeing it still used every day for services because he was a very pious man. Okay, very quickly, because we're moving on. The Moorish style is an unusual style, and we find it in Europe in mid-century, in Berlin, and in Vienna, and in Budapest. It's inspired generically from Spanish or from Egyptian or from vaguely Oriental, called it, styles, lots of horseshoe arches and geometric decoration. These were types of designs were codified by a man named Owen Jones in the 1840s in a big encyclopedia of decorative arts. And in Europe, Jews had to assert themselves with an artistic identity, with a type of branding. I'm not saying they wanted to, but authorities often insisted that they build nice buildings because they were gradually receiving civic rights, religious freedom rights, not always, but slowly across the 19th century. This happened from France to Germany. And they were being asked to build impressive civic buildings, but not to imitate churches. So they had to have a style of their own. So the architects, none of whom were Jewish at the time, developed this Moorish style. And they said it hearkened to the Eastern origins of Jews. It separated them from Europeans. So at the same time, it was saying you're your own people and you have Eastern origins. It was also saying you don't belong here in Europe. You're something different. But when this style was transmitted to America in the 1860s, it was wildly popular, particularly by German Reform Jews in Cincinnati and in New York. And they built big synagogues, the Isaac Wise Synagogue, the Plum Street Synagogue in Cincinnati, and Temple Emmanuel in New York, imitating these big new synagogues in Berlin and Vienna. And for them, it was a Jewish style, and they were proud to announce that they were different. They were part of America, but they were also distinct people. And the architecture professed that. It was also stunning. It was a revelation to a lot of non-Jewish builders and architects because many of the newest technologies were employed, cast iron and glass and gas lighting, things like that. The style trickled down across the country then over the preceding decades from the 1860s, and smaller versions. The complex aspects of it sort of disappeared. They were too expensive, too difficult. But the idea of horseshoe arches and a bit of trim continued. And we have a number of examples in the South. But like the Gothic style, not too many of these survive because these were widely embraced by the Reform movement. And then when they moved on to bigger buildings later on and embraced the classical style, a lot of these were torn down. But we can find them in Texas. And this is not fully Moorish. Some people would say this also recalls the domed towers of Central Europe. Texas, very popular. These eclectic buildings, usual domes. These ones from El Paso and from Beaumont, I'm thinking might also be influenced by the Czech Central European churches, which are in Texas, but in common parlance, they're often still called Moorish. I don't know what the people who built them called them. We don't have any testimony of the builders. These are the most elaborate ones that we found in postcards. Neither of these buildings survive. And these were both by an Orthodox congregation out at Yeshurun, and they're quite late for the Moorish style, 1905. And then the one on the building on the left, almost after it was built, had to be torn down because the land was claimed to build a railroad line around Houston, and a smaller version was built a few blocks away in 1908. This is, to some extent, the last gasp of the Moorish style. This decade, we also have an Orthodox synagogue in Savannah, designed by the Jewish architect Hyman Vitkover in 1910. By this time, classicism was becoming the norm across the South as the Reform movement really became the dominant strain of Jewish practice. Sumter, South Carolina is 1912, 1913, and it's stupendous, more for its stained glass than for its architecture, but it shows it's the last of a trend in architectural style, but it is in the forefront of the really lavish new decoration stained glass windows. We don't know much about the commissioning of these, but we do know the window up in the roundel over the door is signed here as Empire Glass Company, and we've been able to determine that was a glass company out of Georgia, but we don't know much more about it. But these are at least a series of stunning images. So here, in a very typical example, we can see in Atlanta, the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation, which would eventually evolve into what's known as the Temple, has a Moorish building in the 1880s. And then by 1903, I think they have this classical building that with the big front. Another example is the Moorish building from Birmingham, Alabama. These are all torn down. They're all lost. And here's one from Birmingham. Here's Birmingham, and it was replaced by this classical building, which still stands, Temple Emmanuel, in about 1913. Okay. We saw in New Orleans these two-tower synagogue. These were big and lavish, graceful, imposing structure, without a doubt, the most beautiful edifice of the kind in the United States, combining grandeur with simplicity so appropriately that the beholder is charmed. Well, this is newspaper and guidebook, gobbledygook, but these were very big, imposing buildings, and they really put the Jews on the map architecturally, and many cities across the country boasted these. The two-tower theme we found in the big Reform temples that I mentioned in Cincinnati and New York, but you find them in San Francisco and in Seattle. You find them in every city and in major cities across the South. So just a few examples: Baltimore, Jacksonville, Florida. This is Selma, Alabama, a little different, sort of more squat version. So it's still the round arch style, Romanesque style, but it's got these big towers. Montgomery, Alabama, more classical. It has a classical colonnade in the front, but big towers. And in Mobile, Alabama, which have these shorter stair towers on the side. As you see these get broader and squatter, imagine that the spaces on the inside many of them have domes and they're embracing more theater seating, and sometimes seating in a curved pattern. But we also have little vernacular synagogues like this one in Brookhaven, Mississippi, which has a single tower. This is from the 1890s. Okay, so let me just end up by running through classicism again. There's so many examples, I won't dwell on them in detail, but a few of these still survive. Unfortunately, many are gone, and they've only been gone a generation, so a lot could have been saved, but the impact of modernism was such that no one thought these classical buildings before about the 1970s, 1980s were worth keeping. Today, of course, historic preservationists strive mightily to try to keep them. This one is beautifully preserved in Richmond, Beth Ahaba, one of the great synagogues of the South. This one that I visited just last week in Louisville, it's now a church. They would love it to a nearby university, so they would have an auditorium, but that deal has fallen through. So in the meantime, the Black church, kind of a charismatic Pentecostal church, has raised a lot of money. They fixed the roof. They're restoring the sanctuary. And the sanctuary still holds these 3 massive stained glass windows from 1905, some of the earliest big figurative windows of the Reform movement. It's Moses and Abraham. And I think the other is I think it's Isaiah is the 3rd window. I'm not sure. Birmingham, Alabama, Norfolk, Virginia, every city, in almost every city, the Reform embraced classicism, and they cast away their old buildings, whether they were Gothic or Romanesque or Moorish. Here we are in Birmingham. More examples from Chattanooga, Kansas City, and beyond. My favorite buildings of this group, and a few of them still survive, the best is in Natchez, are these little temple-like structures. We looked at the one from Alexandria earlier, which has been demolished, but it was destroyed by fire in 1956. But there's one in Meridian, there's one in Greenville, Mississippi, and they're very emblematic at a time, and they may be nostalgic too. On the one hand, the Reform movement in America is trying to disassociate itself with the Orthodox Jewish immigrants who were coming in at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, the Yiddish-speaking Jews who are in many of the big cities, but they're also in southern cities too. So they're identifying themselves with kind of American civic virtue, the kind of classicism that comes out of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But they, at the same time, I think in the South, there's this sort of lost cause nostalgia. I mean, they're tying themselves in with the architecture of the region, which, you know, in the antebellum period is mostly classicism too. So these buildings will seem familiar to everyone. They fit in quite comfortably. And I won't, I mean, they just go on and on. There's so many, each town. And they continue in the South even into the 1940s, when everywhere else in the country has moved away from classicism. And in Greensboro, it's still there, a very beautiful building. We have in Alabama. This building, I wanted to see in Spartanburg last spring, but I got there a week too late. They had just torn it down. Sadly, it was a century old, and it could have been saved. This one, however, in Portsmouth, Virginia, which is a little Orthodox synagogue, not high design classicism, has these attenuated columns, and it has a traditional Orthodox interior with balconies. This has been saved by the efforts of one woman, a woman named Minette Cooper, who's created a museum and cultural center there, and that preserves some of the Jewish history in that town. All right, there are variations in the 20s and 30s of new forms, and then we shift into modernism in the new period. I don't want to take, I've already gone 50 minutes, I think, so I'm not speak, but I'm going to give you images as I rush through. I didn't plan to go into all of these anyway, but I think you'll want to see them because they'll look somewhat familiar. It's a totally new world after the war. This is transitional in Florida, Miami. Then we get modernism, simplification, stripping down forms, and these are ubiquitous. We find them just as we found classical synagogues in every town. We begin to find these boxes, some more nuanced, some more detailed than others, but all of them quite simple and functional. We also begin to get some expressive modernism, like this in Texas, Houston, right after the war, one of the first modern synagogues, influenced heavily by Frank Lloyd Wright, long before Frank Lloyd Wright ever built a synagogue, and by a Jewish architect. And that's one of the things that's significant. After the war in the South, the largest number of synagogues are built by Jews. They're not always great architecture, but they're Jewish architecture, often members of the congregation and other people. This is the one we looked at in Alexandria, also a Jewish architect. These are sort of ripoffs of an Eric Mendelsohn, but in West Virginia and in Maryland. Miami, it looks like a disco. This is Percival Goodman's design, and it was recently had a multi-million-dollar refurbishment. Jewish architect Sheldon Levitt, who I didn't know about until he came to one of my lectures and told me about his buildings, and they're really actually quite nice modern buildings in Virginia. And then we get these campuses as things spread out, more suburban and larger forms, big geometric forms. Several northern architects like Morris Lapidus, Percival Goodman, Sidney Braverman from Cleveland, projects in the South, but also there's a whole generation of homegrown architects, many of them graduates of Tulane. And Tulane actually has the papers of many of these Jewish architects, which we have to explore, I think, in the coming year. I'll end with this one synagogue in Miami Beach. We don't know very much about it. It still exists. It recently had a refurbishment. It was done in the 60s by Orthodox Jews from New York who moved to Miami and set up a little, and then over the years, and then they created this sort of expressive, almost igloo type of building there. Oh, I think I have one more, and this is a building I saw for the first time in Florida last year. I'd always wanted to, magnificent structure from 1970, all of wood, and heavily influenced by publications about Polish architecture, Jewish synagogues in Poland before their destruction. Continuing the expressiveness of those earlier years, but in a totally natural materials, not concrete, thing like that. So there are more. This is already 50 years old, so there's a whole new generation. So we'll stop there. That's the last slide. So thanks, and I appreciate your attention on this romp through architectural history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gruber. In the interest of time, we're going to do 5 questions, and I have a few online. And so folks in person, get your questions in your head, and then when we end the record, I want to chat a little. But for some folks online asked, were there enough Jews to fill some of these grand buildings that you were showing in New Orleans at the earliest part of your presentation?
It ebbs and flows. So Jews have always been aspirational. So they often built thinking if you build, will attract new members. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes it's because of history, like the Civil War. Sometimes it's just because the upcoming or commerce did. It's because a rival congregation stole your thunder. So it really varies. It really varies. But most of the moves from building to building are actually because congregations are too big for the old building. So for many, many decades, really up until the 1960s and 70s, when the necessity of congregational affiliation began to relax, buildings generally were filled. And if they weren't filled every week, it was expected they would be filled on the high holidays. And we do see changes with the building of smaller sanctuaries and chapels for regular weekly services to differentiate from the spaces for Yom Kippur or for Rosh Hashanah.
So do we have questions in person? I'm going to run this mic over. You could actually just pass it. And yes, speak right into it.
Thank you very much. Just a small question. With the neoclassical buildings, were the facades ever in any way painted with color, not just whitewash, with any kind of color? As you know, that's how ancient Greek temples were.
In America, never. I can't think of any examples for civic buildings or for religious buildings where that would be the case. I thought you were going to ask about decoration, and for synagogues, very little decoration. Sometimes in the pediment, you might have a star. Sometimes on the entablature, you might have an inscription, "My house is a house of prayer for all people," something like that. But for the casual passerby, you wouldn't be able to distinguish whether it was a synagogue or a library or a bank or a town hall, right?
Somebody online asked, do you have any historical architectural references left of the synagogues in small southern towns? This person has extended family in Francisville, Louisiana, and heard that the synagogue closed down in the 40s. So I guess the question is where?
Right. Well, when we did the exhibition, we started looking, where can we find information? So newspapers are one of the easiest places. Sometimes Jewish newspapers, if they exist, but in small towns, that's not usually the case. But local newspapers usually have descriptions of the dedication of a synagogue and even the closing of a synagogue. We know that deep in people's personal archives and in institutional archives, there are family photos and memories and that kind of thing, mementos of weddings and bar mitzvahs, things like that. But museums like the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and the archives at the College of Charleston, they're really just beginning to collect a lot of this stuff. I mean, some of it's been big congregational archives have gone to museums or to the American Jewish Archives, for many decades, but they don't usually have building records. So, and Jews have not really, and non-Jews too, have not paid much attention to the history of the buildings. We know who all the rabbis were, but often we don't know who the architect of the building was. So it's difficult.
Just talk right into it.
Excellent. I noticed that a couple of the synagogues you said were buildings that were acquired from churches and redone. And it almost seems like in some of these southern towns, maybe it's going back the other way now. There were Jews there, and maybe the synagogues are going back to churches to use. I mean, are you seeing a trend for any
absolutely.
particular reuse?
Yeah, absolutely. Synagogues are in the early years, but even today, a new congregation might buy an old church as their first home. They might buy an ice rink, or they might buy some other structure too, but are the easiest to adapt. They already have most of the what's necessary. And churches are buying synagogues for sure whenever they do it. And most people who sell synagogues are happy to sell to other religious congregations because they know that's the most likely scenario for preserving the essence of the building. And in my travels, I've seen many Protestant congregations, and particularly Black congregations, actually be very respectful, almost venerate the Jewish history of the building, and they've kept the memorial plaques, they've kept the inscriptions, they've kept the decorations. And this is something that I am looking at, and a number of other people are looking at, because the other synagogues have been torn down, so we don't know how they were decorated on the inside. But sometimes we can get some clue by going into a church, like I showed you those stained glass windows, which are still there in Louisville, and there's the evidence right in front of us, and much loved by those congregations.
Well, I hate to be the person who has to do this, but we're going to end that there. Everybody says keep them wanting more. And I think folks online and folks here agree that we'll have to have some sort of part 2 because this was fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. As I said, a recording of this will be available soon. We are interested in hearing from you. So if you have any questions, folks online, please shoot us an email, including if you have any questions for Dr. Gruber. What's the best place for people to connect with you?
You can reach out to me by email as long as you put explicitly in the subject line what it is, so that it's not spam. And you can say about Southern Synagogues or something. The email is gruber@gmail.com.
Perfect. And we'll also send a link to that. Just so everybody knows, we have additional programs happening here at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in the coming days. Actually, next Tuesday, we have a book launch from Doug Brooke, his second volume of his book, Rear Pew Mirror, Wrath of the Columns. This is a humor columnist. He's going to share excerpts from his book, and share a little bit of humor along the way. So we invite you all to come and celebrate Doug's book launch. The best way to staying up to date on all the things that are happening at the museum is through our newsletter. So you can sign up for that at msje.org/contact. And that's it. Thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you, Dr. Gruber. Fascinating.